Hello there. I sit here and I stare at the computer and I never want to hit record. So it's been a while since I last recorded a lecture because I didn't do one on muscles for you. And we've all been super busy, I'm sure. So this is recording one for chapter 12, nervous system tissue. And I've been procrastinating on doing this. Just like you've probably been procrastinating on watching it and getting through it. We're fried, right? We're a little burned out of all the work for these online classes and projects and papers and assessments and everybody. But hey, we're going to push through it because we're going to see this to the end. That's where I'm at. So you got to show up for yourself. I'm showing up for you, and let's get started, right? Because we're gonna bang this chapter out. You just took an exam on probably the hardest material, the muscle tissue. So nervous tissue is a little less. It's complicated. I won't kid you, but I think it's easier to wrap your brain around it since you've already had your brain blown up in the last set of lectures. So hopefully you're hanging in there, you guys. I am feeling you. I'm trying to, oh, there it is. I'm trying to make this small so you actually don't just look at me the whole time, but you look at the presentation, and I am in the corner. Okay, so we are talking about nervous system tissue. Nervous tissue. And like I said, I've been procrastinating. I'm sitting at the kitchen table just at a different spot. If you're like, where is she in her house? It's a beautiful sunny day. It's a Sunday. I'm the only one in the house right now. And I'm recording lectures. So, woohoo! Anyway. What do we need to know about this chapter? Well, nervous system tissue, neurons, neuroglia, what they're all about. Start using some of this more complicated terminology with regards to the nervous system. So when we talk about the nervous system, right, nervous system tissue consisted of neurons and it consisted of neuroglia. The neurons are the guys that send the message. I'm trying to find where my pen is. And neuroglia are the helper cells. They don't send the message, but they have different, very specific functions in the nervous system, and we're going to talk about that. So, what do we need? Why do we even need the nervous system? This system is making sure we stay in homeostasis. The endocrine system also supports that, but this is going to detect most things that are happening. Some bypass it, right? We talked about that with the parathyroid gland and the regulation of calcium, which calcium has another important part in the nervous system, just like in the muscle tissue. And it will sense the problems, detect what is it okay, is it not okay, with regard to how are this incoming information comparing to the set points, and then initiate responses as necessary. So when we talk about the nervous system, it has a very specific organization. The nervous system consists of the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. The peripheral nervous system has a sensory division, and sensory means it is incoming. So this will send information to the central nervous system. And that consists of our somatic senses. We looked at those a little bit with the skin, the general senses, pressure, temperature, pain, touch, and that sort of thing. And then the special senses like vision, hearing, equilibrium, smelling, tasting, and we're gonna look at vision in lab, not in lecture. Vision is very complicated, and we're just gonna look at a little bit of it. So that's my sensory division of the peripheral nervous system, which is everything other than the brain and spinal cord. And then I have the motor division. So the motor division is the output from the central nervous system. So you can even see this is the input, sending it to the central nervous system, and then this is the output. And the motor division has two main branches, the somatic nervous system, which talks to skeletal muscle. We've already done that one. And then the autonomic nervous system. So we are not aware of functions pertaining to the autonomic system. Oh, I'm trying to write the word aware. It's like automatic, but it's not. It's autonomic. And autonomic has a couple branches. It has the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And they both talk to the same guys for the most part. I'm going to talk about this when we talk about, I think it's chapter 15. Right now we're in chapter 12, nervous system tissue. The brain is, I think the brain is chapter 14. We're going to do that one. We're going to do chapter 15, and then another chapter. And then another part of the autonomic nervous system is the enteric nervous system, and that talks to the GI tract. So the GI tract is pretty much locally controlled, but there is some output coming off the brain specific for these millions of neurons that populate your gastrointestinal tract. All right, so, but I want to go back to this. Autonomic nervous system has two main branches that you guys think of. The sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight. Fight or flight. All right, that's when you're stressed out. And the parasympathetic nervous system is when you're resting and digesting. Resting in repose, resting in digestion, chilling like a villain, however you want to remember it. That's the paramedic. That's the paramedic. That's the parasympathetic nervous system. Sorry, guys. That is not you paramedics. That's very funny. So this is giving you a little bit of the layout of the central nervous system being the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is everything else of inputs and outputs. Inputs and outputs. Okay, I'm sorry, guys. I think we've already talked about that. When we talk about the functions, right, I got to bring information in. That's my sensory. I've got to send information out. That's my motor. So this is some vocabulary. Motor is going to activate effectors. Effectors are the guys that are going to do the response. And what's going to do the response? Glands and muscles. Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle. It's all motor, right? So because we had the motor division here, and we had skeletal muscle and smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And then you kind of have the middleman, and the middleman I usually kind of think is the central nervous system with the brain and the spinal cord, really the brain. The integrative. Okay, so now we're going to just start getting into all these random specifics. And the first thing we're going to talk about is a neuron. I'm debating talking about neuroglia first. They're easier, but we're committed. So let's do neurons. All right, so this is a neuron. Neurons are electrically excitable. They are the ones that generate the impulse. And another word for impulse that we're going to start talking about is an action potential. That scared me. Okay, so, but first we're going to just spend a little bit of time talking about a neuron and the anatomy. So the neuron has the ends. These are the dendrites, and the dendrites usually, they have the receptors. So they usually receive the information. And then I've got this area here. That's the cell body. Inside the cell body, I have the nucleus with the DNA. I don't see, oh, here it is, Nissl bodies. Nissl bodies are very specific endoplasmic reticulum with ribosomes, so rough endoplasmic reticulum in the cell, a mitochondria, because I need a lot of ATP, so hence I need a lot of oxygen and a lot of glucose constantly. Deprive me of oxygen, my neurons will die. They can't go into anaerobic respiration and live for very long because they're very sensitive to pH levels. And anaerobic respiration makes the environment acidic. And maybe you remember that, maybe you don't. I'm never going to ask you about that. I'm just letting you know. All right, so the dendrites are all these little spikes coming off of the cell body. They have receptors on them. And then I have this area here called the axon hillock. This is the first part of the axon, and this is what will generate, all right, oh, brother's going to be that kind of day, huh? That's fine, I accept it. Generates the action potential. AP, action potential, meaning the nerve impulse. So it starts in the axon hillock, which is the first part of this axon. So the axon is this whole process coming off of it, and it splits into the branches, into these terminals, and at the ends of the terminals are these synaptic end bulbs, and these have vesicles with neurotransmitter. We learned about acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, and we're not going to talk about too many more in this chapter. It is included in this chapter, but I'll just leave that for you. For reference, I will not go over that. Now, this axon, which is the yellow part of this, is wrapped, insulated in myelin. This is called a myelin sheath. Okay? Let's not worry too much that it's a Schwann cell and then whole neurolemma. Don't worry about that. There's gaps where there's no myelin. Where there's no myelin, that is called a node of Ranvier. This is a gap where there's no myelin. And this is important in the future lecture. So I have a myelin sheath, and I have gaps where there's no myelin. Those are my nodes of Ranvier. Myelin is fat, right? I never know where I'm going to go. And fat in the body is white in color. So when I talk about white matter, those are myelinated axons. I'm planting some seeds here with you guys. And that's kind of known as highways. That's all it is, transportation of information. It's not anything else. You also have something in the central nervous system. It's non-myelinated, and that will be gray matter. So we have white matter. Hey, you. And I have gray matter. Or not. I'm not going to miss this at all. And these are cell bodies. This is where the work is being done, not the highways, right? It's also non-myelinated axons. But I want you to think of it as the cell body. Cell body is where the work is being done. All right. So I have white matter, which is myelinated axons, which are my highways. I have gray matter, which are cell bodies. So the myelin is only around the axons. I just like to take a minute and just look at this beautiful thing. Neurons are pretty cool. Let's not worry too much about this whole axon collateral up here. Where's my pen? Oh, way over there. Don't worry about that guy. Don't worry about cytoplasm. I'm not worried. Okay, axoplasm. We have axons, we have myelin, we have nodes of Ranvier, we have axon terminals with all the little branches, the synaptic endobulb that contains vesicles with neurotransmitter. And the impulse will only go one direction. This is a complicated concept when we actually cover the why. But the nerve impulse will only go from the cell body down the axon away toward, the terminals. And then it will move along most likely via a chemical synapse with the neurotransmitter like we saw in muscle tissue. Okay, neurons are the guys that send the electrical signal, the impulse, the action potential. Most are amitotic. They do not divide. Do not, I guess, reproduce or do cell division. No cell division. And like we said, there were 3 parts. There are the dendrites. They usually kind of receive. They have the sensory receptors located on dendrites, the cell body, and then the axon with the axon terminals, synaptic end bulbs. They generate the impulse for sending it away. Okay. All right. So what else do we have going on in the neuron, in the cell body? Like we said, we have mitochondria because I'm going to use a lot of oxygen. I'm going to use a lot of glucose because I need to make a lot of ATP constantly. Anybody have any thoughts about why? Why do we need to always be making ATP? I'm not going to tell you. I have Golgi complex because I'm always making stuff and other stuff going on. I have those really special Nissl bodies that stain very dark for making proteins. That's a rough endoplasmic reticulum. They have a fancy name. And then other sorts of microtubules for managing my cell functions, neurofibrils. I'm not going to ask you that part. Okay, but I have the dendrite. They're highly branched, and they have the sensory receptors. I have the axon, which is a long, thin process. Here's with the axon hillock. That's the trigger zone for the impulse. That is what links up with the cell body. I have collaterals, which are branches. I have the terminals with the synaptic end bulb. That will have vesicles with neurotransmitter. I guess now that I'm talking about this, I don't mind. I really just wasn't into this lecture because you know why? I hate nervous tissue. Okay, so when we talk about neurons, just like joints, just like all this other stuff we've seen, we can talk about them 2 different ways. We can talk about them structurally, and that's what this is talking about. And the next way we can talk about them is functionally. I typically just talk about neurons functionally. What's their function? Kentucky Junction. But let's go over this. So if it is structurally, I will have multipolar neurons. So think of polar as process. A process is things coming off of it. Number of processes extending off the cell body. So a process is all these sticky outy things. So if I have a whole bunch of different dendrites coming off of one cell body, and then of course I only have the one axon, this is a multipolar neuron. Multipolar neurons are found in the central nervous system typically. I'm just going to go typically, and then we're going to look at the next slide and get the specific locations. A bipolar neuron, now look, they almost look the same, right? So when we look at guy number 2, here's my cell body, but it just has one dendrite portion, one axon portion. Now the dendrites then branch, but the branches are coming off of this one single dendrite and not off of the cell body, so hence there's really only 2 processes coming off, so it's bipolar. You find bipolar neurons in the retina. I would love to talk about them, but they're complicated. I think it's also in the inner ear, but I'm not sure. The retina's in the eye, guys, in case you didn't know that. And then I have a unipolar neuron, and a unipolar neuron has a cell body off to the side, and then it has dendrites and axon, with the axon terminals branching off of it. So it's really only one thing coming off of the cell body, so it's a unipolar neuron, and these are most of your sensory neurons. So these are all of your sensory neurons. Oh, most, okay, not all. All right, so multipolar, most in the central nervous system of the brain and spinal cord. Ooh, look, Bipolar, I knew it was in the retina. In the inner ear, I thought, but I didn't remember that it was in the olfactory area. And then unipolar are my sensory neurons. And what's interesting with these sensory neurons, we're not really going to talk about it, but you will find all the cell bodies. Like when you feel something with your toe, that's a neuron all the way from your toe shooting all the way up your leg, having the cell body right next to the spinal cord. This is kind of the spinal cord. And then it zips in there. So it usually has cell bodies in a blob outside the spinal cord. That's called the ganglion. And that's called the dorsal root ganglion. And then I have ventral root ganglions. But I'm talking about spinal cords today or in this class. But it blows me away, right? Neurons are long. And when you break them, you break them. Okay. Then these are other special guys. I don't know. We're going to move on. Functionally is much more easy and comfortable to talk about. Functional classification again, there's only the three. I have a sensory neuron. Sensory neurons bring impulse, whatever you want to talk about, toward the central nervous system. I will have an interneuron that is within the central nervous system, brings information between neurons, right? Inter means between, so it's going to connect neuron to neuron. And I have a motor neuron. A motor neuron carries impulses away from the central nervous system. Okay, so it's sensory, neuron, interneuron, motor neuron. Now, sensory neuron has another name, afferent. So afferent is a sensory neuron. And motor is efferent. It just differs from one, because efferent is a way. Differs from one letter. Okay, so I have sensory afferent neurons, motor efferent neurons, and then interneurons, also known as association neurons. I guess I should throw that in there. I don't really like that one, but I guess I will have to take that on the test. They're between neurons. So they're typically in the central nervous system. Oh, and I already said within the central nervous system. So that's another way that we can talk about neurons. Am I a sensory neuron, an interneuron, a motor neuron? I'm much more comfortable talking about that because that gives me a direction of what's going on. Okay. All right. So that's my neuron, the anatomy, the different kinds. And then I have my neuroglia, and my neuroglia are my helper guys. They are also gray matter, but we're not really going to talk about them like that. They can divide and be replaced. They do not generate any type of action potential, and there's different ones whether I'm in the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. So the first type that I have is an astrocyte. Astrocytes are in my central nervous system. Where are you, Mr. Astrocyte? Oh, they're the big, no. Really good then. Where are you? I'm looking for astrocyte. Oh, protoplasmic astrocyte, this big blue guy here. Astrocytes guide neurons when they're moving and migrating where they need to be. And they are providing nutrients to the neurons. They're kind of like the nursemaid, right? Of the neuron. The housekeeper of the neuron, cleaning everything up. Astrocytes also create the blood-brain barrier. And that's going to be important in the chapter on the brain because this blood-brain barrier exists in a majority of the brain area. There's a few places where there isn't one, and it's important to know why there wouldn't be. So those are my astrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are in the central nervous system, and they make myelin around central nervous system axons. And myelin is like insulation. And when we talk about myelin, you're like, okay, who cares? It's white matter, it's insulation. But what myelin allows, and whether it's in the central nervous system or the peripheral one, is for nerve impulses to travel a lot faster. So they speed up the rate of impulse, how quickly it'll pass along. Okay, so I have microglia. They are small phagocytic cells. They're kind of like the white blood cell in the central nervous system to clean everything up. And the other important cell that I have in the central nervous system is the ependymal cell. And ependymal cells are the cells that will make the cerebrospinal fluid. There's no blood inside your brain, right? Crack open your head, it's not going to be bloody because I have the blood-brain barrier. So the fluid that's actually taking care of my brain cells is cerebrospinal fluid, and that there's a whole special little flow of CSF that we will talk about, in chapter 12. No, in chapter 14. So we're not going to cover it at this point, but ependymal cells, we will see them again when we cover the flow of CSF and how that whole system works inside the brain. All right, so those are my central nervous system helpers, neuroglia, and then I have my peripheral nervous system helpers, and the one that I have, one of the two, is Schwann cells. So Schwann cells make the myelin sheath around peripheral nervous system axons, and this is what degrades when somebody has multiple sclerosis. Their myelin sheath is being munched up by their own immune system. It's an autoimmune disorder. And Connor did his paper on that, so he knows all about it. And the Schwann cells, this is kind of interesting. They participate in axon regeneration in the peripheral nervous system, and actually, like axon non-regeneration, they inhibit other growth. So they're kind of like a big bully, big brother of these neurons. And then they have satellite cells, and I guess satellite cells are just kind of helper cells like astrocytes in the peripheral nervous system. In where there's ganglia is a cluster of cell bodies. So they exist in there. All right, of course I have an itchy nose. So what you don't need to know is that how Schwann cells make their myelin versus how oligodendrocytes make their myelin is slightly different, but we're not going to go into that process. I guess this is just a picture showing you the peripheral nervous system neuroglia. So I will have Schwann cells making the myelin sheath around axons outside of the central nervous system. And I will have these little satellite cells in a ganglion as just little assistants, little administrative assistants. Okay, so these next few slides talk about the myelin sheath. And like I said, the myelin sheath, this is all just a Schwann cell. In the central nervous system is a little bit different than the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system, but all I really want you to know is that myelin is a lipid, so lipids are fat. It's a fatty insulative layer. And oligodendrocytes are responsible for making myelin in the central nervous system. Schwann cells are responsible for making myelin in the peripheral nervous system. And I will have gaps in the myelin sheath, and those are called nodes of Ranvier. And why do I care about that? Because they increase the speed of the impulses, how they're conducted. It's kind of cool, but we'll talk about that, I guess, later. Okay. Stay tuned. Woohoo. All right. And so this picture I don't really care about. And this is just a cool stained picture of myelin and axons and plasma membranes. That's all right. Okay, so this is an interesting little thing of gray matter versus white matter, and it's showing you. So right here is the brain. Brain is on the right side, a cartoon representation, and then an actual picture. And then on the left side is the spinal cord. Now remember, gray matter, we're saying our cell bodies. Cell bodies is where the work is done. And we're just going to leave it at that. And white matter is myelinated axons. And these are my highways. So these are bringing the information either toward or away from the cell bodies. So in the brain, it's all white matter on the inside. Okay? All right, I've got some gray matter. So there's some cell bodies in the very center region of the brain, but then my gray matter on the brain is on the outside, right? All of this cortex and this ups and downs, increasing surface area so I can have greater intelligence than a field mouse. Gray matter's on the outside, taking advantage of all the ridges and the grooves. Now in the spinal cord, it's totally flipped around. The gray matter is on the inside. So gray matter's on the inside of the spinal cord, but gray matter's on the outside later. That's why if you take a blow to the brain, your cell bodies are pretty much right there on the other side of your skull and the meninges. In the spinal cord, the white matter's on the outside. And in the brain, the white matter's on the inside, right? All my little highways. And then this is just an actual picture. Although the white matter looks orangey brown in that picture of the spinal cord, and you can't see the central canal, little hole in there somewhere. Oops. Ah, all right, whatever, we don't need anything else. Okay, so I had white matter. My white matter, myelinated axons, deep in the brain, superficial in the spinal cord, gray matter, unmyelinated axons, but really it's the cell bodies, and it's neuroglia on the outer portion of the brain, superficial in the brain, deep in the spinal cord. So they flip direction, orientation. So I thought that was kind of cool. All right, well, we're going to stop there. I'm going to take a little break and come back after I fold laundry. I think you needed to know that. All right, I'll see you guys in a little bit.